Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Aiden Ziegelaar, and I'll be talking to you about consumer data right and how it securely democratizes data to enable world-class consumer mobility and utility. Awesome, that's the right slides. So yeah, I'm a lead consultant at Cognizant. For those of you not in the consulting game, it's exactly like normal software and data development, except you get to say the words "it depends" a whole lot more. And my primary remit is helping clients digitally transform, and that can be a bit of a nebulous topic, but essentially it boils down to ensuring that our clients are leveraging technology effectively to get the greatest operational efficiencies that it can provide. So I come from a cloud-native software and security background, and that's what first led me to get involved in consumer data rights implementation, specifically due to the high security requirements in it. I'm the holder of a lot of opinions. Some of them are even useful. Let's hope the Venn diagram between useful opinions in this presentation is close to a circle. And my postgrad qualifications are in electrical and electronics engineering, so low-level languages will always be my first love. But despite my previous track record, I can promise you this presentation does not include any references to certain low-level memory-safe languages. So, my goal for this talk is to explain the platform methodologies behind consumer data right and how they relate to modern data practices. And so, we'll start by diving into the driving forces behind consumer data right and the technologies that consumer data right replaces. We'll then start to look at some of the concepts in CDR and the relationships between them. Then we'll look at some parallels between modern data engineering practices such as data contracts and data meshes. And then finally, we'll explore my most favorite part of the system, the security of the system, and how consumer data right ensures that our private data stays private. So, who's come across consumer data right before? Who knows what it is? Perfect. This is going to be new to everyone, so I've chosen a good topic. So in a nutshell, consumer data right is a system that has been written into legislation that requires providers to present the data that they hold about their consumers in a uniform and secure way. It provides consumers with a method by which to share their data with entities of their choosing in a way that preserves both the ownership and integrity of that data. And it also prevents overprivileged access to the underlying systems on which that data resides. Currently, this system is already active in the banking and energy sectors, with more sectors expected to be required to implement the system soon. So, to answer the question of why we need consumer data right, we first need to understand that a market already exists for this data. Anyone who's applied for a credit card or has a mortgage probably knows the really painful process of downloading bank statements and sending them through to your broker, or filling out extremely detailed means testing forms. In a pre-CDR world, typically two methods by which we could share our data. Documentation upload, like the bank statements that I just mentioned, or screen scraping, where you give access to your accounts to an automated system for a third party to collect the data. Neither of these options really presents a particularly compelling case. And whilst the ecosystem is still maturing, so there's still plenty of these old systems around, consumer data right provides us with a really exciting new alternative. So, when we look at documentation upload, typically these exports come in the form of a PDF. And who here has ever scraped data programmatically from PDFs? Would you do it again? No? Okay, yeah, me neither. It's usually not a nice process. However, PDFs are really handy for being human readable, meaning that if we're providing documentation in the form of a PDF, there's probably some sort of manual or semi-manual process sitting behind it. I've tried to capture what using PDFs looks like in this day and age, or at least what it feels like. But in today's digital world, adding a manual step that may have a backlog of days or weeks is not aligned with the instantaneous feedback that we're used to as consumers. So that brings us to the other side of the coin, which is screen scraping. You know what can easily be passed by a machine? It's HTML. It's still not my favorite data source to deal with by any means, but give me HTML over a PDF any day. To provide immediate feedback, many tools existed that would ask for the user's credentials, log in as the user, and then scrape the user's data from, say, their bank statements page. This process could typically be fully automated, but requires us to put a lot of trust in the application that we're providing credentials to. The analogy I typically use is that when you take your car to a mechanic, you usually take your car key off your keyring, give your car key to the mechanic, rather than giving them the keys to your house, workplace, gym, and throwing in a copy of your birth certificate just for the sake of it. By providing credentials to third-party applications, we're giving them a very wide-ranging set of powers. How do we know that they're going to delete them when we actually ask them to? How do we know that the app we just signed up for to cry about our Uber Eats usage isn't going to open up a new credit card under our name? We can assume they're going to do the right thing, but why would we give them the option not to? So to start with, I just want to go over some basic concepts in the consumer data right ecosystem that will form the basis for our discussions moving forwards. The first thing we need to understand is the entities that participate in the ecosystem. To start with, we have the consumers. These are you and me. Anyone with a bank or energy account can participate in the CDR ecosystem as a consumer. There's an important distinction to make here, though, because even though we are consumers of the product, we are not direct consumers of the data. And as you can imagine, there are quite a few potential customers for the CDR ecosystem. I've just got the number of Australians with bank accounts up there. It's just 20.8 million. So yeah, by and large, the primary participants in the ecosystem. On the other side, though, we have the data holders. And these are the entities that we have accounts with and store our data, be it personal data, transaction records, or historical energy usage. Consumer data right seeks to break down the siloing of this data that's been maintained by these data holders and allow us as consumers to use it for our own benefit. It's important to note, though, that CDR is not just a fancy way for us to download our data personally, because the average person might go copy-pasting that data anywhere, or they might actually be tempted to modify it to make it look better on paper than it actually is. And so we also have the concept of an accredited data recipient. And this is an entity that the ACCC has vetted and found to be an acceptable steward of our data. These might be competitors to our current provider who can analyse our data to see if they can provide us a better deal. They could be applications that use our data to provide additional benefit, such as calculating our carbon footprint or providing financial advice. They could also be service providers who need our data to perform analysis as to whether we qualify for a product, such as the mortgage or credit card example I used right at the start. At the time of writing, there are 48 data recipients in the ecosystem, and some of the really interesting ones are actually based right here in Perth. And then overseeing the whole thing, we have the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which is the agency that ensures consumer protection in Australia. They decide who is allowed onto the CDR platform, and they maintain the control plane that oversees it. And of course, it goes without saying there's only one of these. So to summarise the method of action of consumer data right, a consumer provides consent to a data holder to share their data with a data recipient, and membership in this entire ecosystem is governed by the ACCC. So I've drawn a very complex diagram to illustrate this. There we go. So overseeing the operation right at the top, we have the ACCC. Participants communicate with the ACCC in order to maintain and participate in the ecosystem, get information about other participants, product discovery, all of that sort of stuff. And then we as consumers only interact with the data holders and the data recipients, which is really good because you're not going to need to take a number at the local Department of Transport and wait for an hour to access this service. It's all automated. And so a question I normally get from people at this point is, it's just an API, right? It's not data, it's just an API. But I'm going to make the argument that this API in particular is a data product because there are a lot of parallels between consumer data right and modern data engineering practices. The other thing I'm going to do is use the Azure definition of what are commonly used interfaces for natively accessible data products because it just fits my narrative and says it includes APIs. So, the first data practice that we're going to get into is data contracts, right? So data contracts are really cool. They provide us with a way to have certainty around the data that's going to be produced, how we can consume it, ensures interoperability between those producers and consumers, and keeps everyone accountable. No more pushing to production and then your dashboard's breaking all the way downstream somewhere. But standardizing data across a company can be really hard. The business units might be different. That data that they have might be siloed and not used across the wider business. And the technologies and the maturities of those business units might be very different as well. So it can be a very difficult task to standardize data across a company. So consumer data right decides to do that across the entire nation. The data is definitely siloed, right? There's different businesses, technologies are completely different. There are very different digital maturities between the companies that are implementing consumer data right. And of course, every company that has this data has different data teams, so their interpretation of all of this is all up for grabs as well. So I really wanted to capture one of the cool things about the data contracts used by consumer data right, and that is that the consumer data standards provide strong data contracts, and the contracts tell us what to expect. Is this field going to be a string? Is it going to be a number? What does the structure of the object look like? All of that sort of stuff. Provides us with a really good programmatic view. But on the other side, the data contracts also have really rich semantic meaning to eliminate ambiguity. So contracts, what do we expect? Semantics, what does it actually mean? So to dive into the programmatic side of it, it uses Open API to define the interfaces for these data products, right? And from a programmatic side, it's really great because Open API is a really well-known technology that is interoperable with a whole bunch of tools and everyone's familiar, which is very good when you're trying to implement something across a wide range of companies. Lots of open source tooling, and there's also testing suites you can use to test that your data is programmatically correct or synaptically correct. So in terms of the data contracts exist between the ACCC, the data holders, and the data recipients, right? And so all of these have well-defined ways of communicating, but we as the consumers are the ones receiving the benefit, and so the way we interact with data recipients and data holders is slightly different because data recipients are usually providing a unique value to us, right? And so there's no contract around what that unique value is. That is defined by the data recipient, and the data holders, they all have different ways of authing and different methods and all that sort of stuff. So that might be a little bit unique as well. But everything above the user is governed by these data contracts. And the other cool thing about using Open API specifications, especially from an implementer's side, is that the rich ecosystem has tools like Open API Generator, and that allowed us to generate types and endpoints and all of that sort of stuff and take away the human element from building a lot of this stuff. So yeah, it was a really good experience from an implementer perspective to be able to generate all of this stuff programmatically. So let's take a look at the Open API, an extract from the Open API specification. So here we've got a rate, type is string, so programmatically we know what to expect. It's got a description for those of us that want a human readable description for it, but then it also has this extension to the Open API spec, which is XCDS type, and the XCDS type is a rate string. And so a rate string is something that's defined in the wider data standards as part of the data contracts. And so here's the definition of a rate string. It's a string representing a percentage, e.g. an interest rate, and then it goes on to give us a whole bunch of examples and a bunch of business rules around how many significant figures, all of that sort of stuff. And yeah, it's really good. It provides us with semantic meaning to what that string is inside the data contract. Now, if you're really eagle-eyed, this is a extract I took on Friday from the data standards. You'll notice there's actually a mistake on this page. Can anyone see it? Yeah, Hamish has it. It's the minus. So the data contract definitions are fallible, right? These semantic meanings are they're written by humans, and so we're never going to get it right 100% of the time. But the important thing is, what do we do when we get it wrong? And a large part of data contracts is making sure that it's a living document and we can update it and provide corrections and all that sort of stuff. So also on Friday, I went and opened a GitHub issue with the ACCC to say, there's an error in the rate string common type. Here's the description. Here's what we want to change. Areas affected, change proposed. And has anyone ever had a government department get back to them in 5 minutes? No? Just me? Okay, because that's how long it took. And there's a change in progress that is going to fix the issue, and it's coming out in the next lot of standards. So yeah, excellent. But nothing is perfect, right? The ACCC can provide really, really good standards, but at the end of the day, we've got over 100 participants in this ecosystem, and no matter how how much we try to eliminate ambiguity, the fact that it's being implemented over 100 times means we can expect some variation. I mean, we implemented it for multiple clients, and I'm sure even between our own implementations, there's a little bit of variation. So the ACCC has actually gone through and done a whole bunch of reviews of the data quality, right? So they've completed over 80 reviews and raised over 250 separate issues relating to data quality with data holders. The only issue I really have with this is that the ACCC provides tooling for things like security and participation in the ecosystem and all that sort of stuff, but there's a much broader section that data holders need to implement. So this is a little bit of a gap. And the ACCC has a little bit of an advantage over the private sector here because it's the law, right? So if you don't agree with the data standards, then you're going to get fined, right? And there have actually been some cases where fines have been levied against banks and utility providers because they failed to meet their commitments from a data quality perspective. And so this probably doesn't really align to the public sector, to the private sector as much. I'd love to be able to fine our data teams for breaking data contracts, but they're not really on board with the idea. But we can at least take a learning to at least track the costs incurred by breaking data contracts. And then finally, the last part of the data contracts is that they also provide assurances of non-functional requirements. This might be all the usual suspects like latency, uptime, all of that sort of stuff. But the other cool thing is that it also provides a non-functional requirement around data currency. And different organizations are very different in the way, or have very different assurances about their data currency. So the way the NFR is defined in the standards is if it's on your website or accessible through your website, then you need to have the same stuff available through CDR. So if you update your customer's energy usage daily, then daily updates in CDR. If it's by the hour, hourly updates in CDR. So we're making sure that we're not actually providing an inferior service than the company already provides. And I thought that was a really cool approach from a data contracting perspective. So now we can take a look at the ecosystem a little bit more and see we've got disparate entities presenting data products under a centralized discovery framework. And now, does this sound familiar to anyone? Because it should. It's pretty much the concept behind a data mesh, right? So going back to our ecosystem, we can break it down into both the data mesh concepts and the typical layers of a data mesh. So there's 4 key data mesh concepts. And the first is domain ownership, right? The ACCC isn't out there hosting a Snowflake instance or data lake somewhere that everyone's funneling data into that recipients can pull data from. No. Instead, the data holders themselves need to maintain their data products, they need to support their data products, and most importantly, they retain ownership of the data. The data isn't going anywhere else. They are the holders of the data. They are the source of truth. It is all kept within that business domain. The second concept is that data is used as a product, right? So in this case, data is consumed by domain external parties. And that's the data recipients. And the data recipients exist because they give us, we're providing data recipients the underlying data to provide us, the consumers, with enriched experiences. So data, in this case, is really treated as a first-class product. And the second last point is federated governance. This might actually be the only data mesh that also has federal governance, but yeah. So there's a good balance between self-policing and enforcement, and policies are really a collaboration between the arbiters, the ACCC, implementers, the data holders, and consumers, the data recipients. And all of this culminates in a self-serve data platform, which is really the driving, the core concept of a data mesh. And we can break it down into the planes that typically exist in a data mesh as well. So to start off, we have the mesh supervision plane, and this is handled by the ACCC. It handles things like product discovery, inter-party auth, security, ecosystem membership, all of that sort of stuff. All of the commonality is handled by the ACCC as our mesh supervision plane. Then we have our data infrastructure plane, and data infrastructure is owned by the providers who are required to expose data products. What this actually looks like, we don't really have much of an idea, right? Every data holder is going to have a very different set of infrastructure that holds the data that they need to present. So we have a range of data systems, and we want to develop data products on them. So that brings us to the developer experience plane. It's inwardly facing from the data holder perspective, because the data holder data teams need to be able to produce data products on their existing data infrastructure. But it's outwardly influenced by the data mesh plane, because there's a lot of stuff going on that is also governed by the ACCC. So, and then all of this, of course, is consumed by the data recipients. So basically, we've got our data infrastructure pushing data up into data products, which are presented in our data plane and are governed by the ACCC. So the next concept I wanted to talk about was the data consumer lifecycle, which is a really interesting point, right? Like, we don't just want to have data products that live forever, they have life cycles. So I'm going to introduce a new concept here. We've already talked about data recipients, but we haven't talked about software products. So data recipients might have multiple products, be that a finance product, a credit score product, all of that sort of stuff. And so each of those would be a separate software product, but they come under the one data recipient. And so depending on whether you're a good actor or a bad actor in the ACCC ecosystem, you might, be active all the time, or you might be suspended for misconduct. And then, if it gets even worse, it might be suspended or revoked. From a software product perspective, we have both the concepts of active and inactive. And then, we can, of course, retire a data product as well, a software product as well. And then that's the final state for that. So there's a rich data consumer life cycle in there as well. The question often gets asked about the data product life cycle. And in the case of CDR, it's a bit of a unique case, because you don't really get to be retiring a data holder product if you're a current company that is required by law to implement this data product. You have to implement it, you have to be active, right? So it's a straight line. You start, you're active, and then in the case of, I think, a couple of neobanks, they've been removed, right? Because they collapsed. So, but that's very rare. I think there's been only 2 occurrences of people actually retiring from the CDR ecosystem as a data holder. So yeah, that is the data mesh side of it. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about my favorite part of CDR, which is the security. What's keeping all of this data that is flying all over the place safe in transit, and making sure only the right parties actually have access to it. So let's start with the consumer journey. The consumer journey is pretty basic. You're on a data recipient, you say, I want to give you access to my data. The data recipient goes, yep, all good, we'll send you to the data holder. The data holder then asks you to log in, authorize access, and then you get sent back to the data recipient, and you can manage that sharing arrangement from both the data recipient and the data holder. Simple, right? Very easy, 4 screens, we got data shared pretty easily, which is what we want from a consumer perspective, right? But behind it all is this standard by OpenID, which is called financial grade APIs. And this is the not so simple part. This is all the stuff, all of the extensions to the standard OAuth framework that keeps our data secure. And so, yeah, CDR uses a standard called financial grade APIs baseline, and also implements financial grade APIs advanced. There's a new version 2 out of it, but CDR hasn't got around to mandating that yet. So we're going to be talking about version 1. And this is what's actually going on behind the scenes. Now, there's nothing more boring than being walked through a sequence diagram, so don't worry, I'm not going to do that. But this is just to show the complexity of it. I will go through some steps, so you'll have to bear with me, but yeah. So I wanted to go through some of the important parts of the standard that I think are kind of cool from an authorization perspective. So the first thing is that it uses PKCE, or proof key for code exchange. When a data recipient wants to create a new authorization request, they create a secret string that only they know, and then they create a hash of that string. And then when they create the push to authorization request to send it to the data holder's authorization server, they send through the hash. The consumer goes through all the processes to get the consent and the access token and all that sort of stuff. They send it back to the client, and then the data recipient client makes the request to the data holder's authorization server with the original string to say, you got the hash, this is the original string, this proves that the same person who asked for the token is the person receiving the token. And so that really comes in at these 2 points here. Right at the top, we generate the code and verifier. We send the pushed authorization request with our code. Then at the end, when we get the authorization code back, we send the authorization code and the verifier to the data holder authorization server and receive an access token. And so the thing that's really cool here is that the user, the end user, you and me, we are the medium of transport for the authorization code and all of that sort of stuff. But at no point can we actually intercept that process to retrieve an access token ourselves. So yeah, it's a nice thing to make sure that only accredited data holders and data recipients are communicating. The next thing we have is mutual TLS between everything above the user. I, as a user, don't typically use an SSL certificate when connecting to services, so I assume the rest of you are the same. But service to service, there's no reason why we can't have mutual TLS, right? So not only are you presenting a certificate as the server, you're also receiving a certificate from the person connecting to you. And this unlocks another cool little piece of technology called certificate-bound access tokens. So the access tokens themselves, they're sent over the wire all the time, right? We need to send an access token to say, I have the correct authorization to access this resource. But because we're using mutual TLS, we also have a certificate fingerprint. And so the access token that we receive contains a fingerprint of our certificate so that when we connect as a data recipient, our access token is bound to our certificate. So if somehow someone man in the middle's our JWT token, then unless they also have the SSL certificate that is stored on our server and is never sent over the wire, then they can't actually use that access token to access any resources. And so that really comes into play at this last bit where you're requesting protected resources, you've got your certificate-bound access token, you're making the request, and whatever you get back will ensure that it is, it's the same parties interacting over and over again. And so all of this is supported by really robust PKI governance as well. So CDR has some root certs. All of the certs used for mutual TLS and by servers presenting SSL certificates is all administered by the ACCC. It's only provisioned once you're onboarded into the ecosystem. And you retain ownership of all of the key material and all that sort of stuff. So it's all very private, which is what we want in a system that is dealing with our banking data. So consumer data right basically gives users secure control over their data whilst preserving data integrity. And it achieves this through the implementation of modern data practices. So what's next for CDR? It's been a little bit quiet on the CDR front for the last couple of years. We did a lot of implementations and then didn't hear much about it. It is starting to pick up traction, and so we're seeing a lot more companies come out with products built on top of CDR, and a lot of data providers are also becoming data recipients in order to share data or receive data from their competitors and stuff like that. So it's really good for competition and really good for user mobility. The other cool thing that just happened, and this happened in August, so after this talk was accepted, and I'm really happy that this happened because it gives me a nice little bit of news, but it's no longer just going to be a source of data. So action initiation has just been added to the Consumer Data Standards legislation, allowing for write back. So not only can you, get your bank balance in your application, that's a data recipient, you can also ask that data recipient to make transactions on your behalf and, all good stuff like that. So I set out on this talk to explain the platform methodologies behind consumer data right and how they relate to modern data practices. I really hope that's what's happened and you've all got some understanding about what consumer data right is, how it all operates and all the technologies behind it. And thanks for listening, everyone. If anyone would like to connect and heckle me online, then that is my LinkedIn. So feel free to jump on. And do we have time for questions or?
No.
No, okay. Heckling online only. Yeah.
No, sorry, but go and find Aiden afterwards. Thanks, Aiden.